If you're considering separation, I won't stand in your way, but I want to stay with our son." The words hung in the air after our heated argument. Richard exhaled deeply, his shoulders sagging with what looked like relief, while I scrambled for the right response. Before I could speak, our son, Stephen, broke the silence. With quiet conviction, he revealed what I had only suspected: the woman Richard so fervently defended was his mistress. Stephen's bluntness caught me off guard, but it also brought a flicker of dark amusement to my face. "My name is Cynthia, a 39-year-old freelance graphic designer balancing a demanding career, household responsibilities, and raising Stephen, now in 7th grade. For 12 years, I've carried most of the financial burden in our marriage. Richard has drifted from job to job with no real stability, relying on my steady freelance income to sustain our family. Despite the challenges, I've managed to grow my career through consistent referrals, currently focusing on creating educational materials. Now that Stephen is becoming more self-sufficient, I've started working more outside the home, though my heart remains tethered to him. While our household has mostly been harmonious, Richard's indifference to contributing, both as a partner and a parent, has been a constant undercurrent of tension. At 41, he rarely holds down full-time work and offers little help with chores or parenting. Stephen, though soft-spoken, has become my biggest support, often stepping up where his father falls short. It's as though he's internalized the work ethic I've modeled all these years. Lately, however, Richard's behavior has grown increasingly suspicious. He comes home late without explanation, feigns enthusiasm for parenting, and has unexpectedly taken over Stephen's school drop-offs and pickups, tasks he'd never shown interest in before. His sudden attentiveness, particularly towards Stephen's volleyball practices, struck me as uncharacteristic and raised questions I couldn't ignore. The truth began unraveling one day after a routine shopping trip. On a whim, I passed by the volleyball club and spotted Richard chatting animatedly with a woman who seemed to work there. The ease of their interaction felt unsettling, especially since Richard had told me he was out of town for work that day. When I approached, the woman turned to me with a bright smile. "You must be Stephen's mom," she said. I nodded, caught off guard by her familiarity. She introduced herself as Emma, but something about her demeanor felt off, too casual, too comfortable. Richard's expression shifted instantly, his cheerful facade replaced by tension as he quickly ended their conversation. The car ride home was painfully silent, his avoidance confirming my growing unease. Emma began appearing more frequently after that. She'd stop by our house under the pretense of checking on Stephen, though her visits always seemed timed to coincide with Richard's presence. They chatted effortlessly in our living room while I watched from the sidelines, their connection undeniable. Whatever concern she claimed to have for Stephen, it was clear her real focus was on Richard. Even Stephen had started pushing back against his father's newfound devotion to chauffeuring him everywhere, snapping in frustration when I tried to discuss it. "I don't get why he's suddenly so interested in driving me," he muttered one day, his tone mirroring my own suspicions. As I pieced everything together, the late nights, the uncharacteristic interest in our son's activities, the awkward tension at home, one thing became painfully clear: Emma's presence in our lives was no accident. The ease with which she and Richard interacted, coupled with his increasing detachment from me, painted a picture I could no longer ignore. The cracks in our marriage were no longer subtle, they were gaping, and as the truth of Richard's infidelity settled in, I realized it was time to face the future with clarity, for my son and myself. A month passed, and the signs of Richard's growing distance only deepened my suspicions about his fidelity. He began staying out later and sometimes disappeared for days without a word. One evening, after slipping in well past midnight, I tried to make light of the situation by jokingly accusing him of cheating, but his reaction was far from amused. He stood up suddenly, glaring at me with a cold intensity, and snapped that he was taking care of Stephen and that I should stop meddling in things that weren't my business. His defensiveness sent a chill through me, confirming mes doutes. The tension in our home became palpable. Stephen, who had always steered clear of our arguments, approached me one evening, hesitating before he spoke. He told me he'd noticed something unsettling about Emma, a staff member at his volleyball club, and he thought she might be involved with Richard. Stephen described how clingy Emma had been around him at the club and expressed discomfort at the fact that she'd been visiting our house frequently. Hearing this from Stephen was both a relief and a further blow. It confirmed that my suspicions weren't just paranoia, but it also left me with little clarity on how to confront the situation. One afternoon, after returning from a client meeting, I was greeted by the unmistakable sound of laughter and conversation coming from the living room. Richard and Emma were sitting together, chatting as though it were their home, with no sign of Stephen joining in. As soon as I entered, Richard stiffened, while Emma flashed me an almost too casual smile. She mentioned, without hesitation, that Richard had invited her over. The way she addressed him by his first name, the comfort with which she was in our space, it all felt too familiar, too intimate. When I remarked on her frequent visits despite her demanding job, she arrogantly replied that it was part of her duties. Her smugness left me speechless, and the more I observed, the clearer it became. There was something much deeper between them than a simple professional relationship. The air in our home grew thick with unspoken accusations and simmering tension. It wasn't just about Richard and Emma anymore, it was about how their presence was impacting our family, especially Stephen, who was caught in the middle of this mess. Emma's brazen comfort in my home began to gnaw at me. She casually critiqued how lived-in our house was, implying that it wasn't up to her standards of cleanliness, all while wearing an irritatingly smug grin. Her words were thinly veiled jabs at my housekeeping, suggesting that, although our home had a cozy feel, I wasn't keeping up with things as I should. To my shock, Richard didn't defend me. Instead, he laughed along with her, agreeing with her subtle criticisms. It was as if I wasn't even in the room. I had been juggling freelance work, household chores, and parenting alone for years, but Richard had never once stepped in to lighten the load. His neglect had made it nearly impossible to keep everything perfect, and now Emma was using it against me. Feeling humiliated, I retreated to the bedroom, overwhelmed by a mix of frustration, sadness, and disbelief. I felt utterly sidelined in my own home, as though I was invisible, my efforts unnoticed and unappreciated. The fear that Emma might be replacing me in Richard's life, both as a partner and a mother figure to Stephen, loomed large, yet I couldn't bring myself to confront her. I was too afraid of the fallout, of how it would affect Stephen and his relationship with the volleyball team, where Emma had insinuated herself so comfortably. And yet, every visit, every shared moment between Richard and Emma, felt like a blatant challenge, a taunt disguised as concern for Stephen's education, but clearly something much more personal. Determined to uncover the truth, I began documenting every shred of evidence that could confirm my suspicions of Richard's infidelity. The receipts were a gut-wrenching confirmation: motel stays, expensive dinners, luxury items, things he'd always claimed were beyond our reach. It was as if his betrayal was being financed by the lies he'd spun for years. Despite the heartache, I set about meticulously gathering proof, wrestling with the idea of divorce but holding back. For Stephen's sake, he was nearing the end of high school, and I wanted to shield him from the storm until then. But the financial implications of Richard's spending puzzled me. Even with his salary, there was no way he could afford such extravagance. As I tried to make sense of it all, a terrifying thought crossed my mind. We had a college savings account for Stephen, one I had set up to ensure his future was secure. The possibility that Richard might be dipping into it for his affair was a horrifying notion that filled me with dread. I rushed to check the account's transactions, only to find that significant withdrawals had been made in recent months. The balance was dwindling at an alarming rate. I had been so focused on managing our monthly expenses and credit card bills that I hadn't kept an eye on this account. But now I saw the truth. The money I had saved for Stephen's future was being used to fund Richard's betrayal. In that moment, it wasn't just about infidelity, it was about the very foundation of our family being dismantled. Richard's affair wasn't just a personal betrayal, it was an assault on our son's future. This was unforgivable. Putting on a facade of normalcy for Stephen's sake, he was entering a critical time in his life, and I couldn't bear to disrupt his world with the chaos brewing beneath our roof. But maintaining this act took its toll. My mind was constantly racing, and even simple tasks, both at home and at work, became overwhelming. Mrs. Alexis, a longtime client, noticed my distress and offered her support, which, though embarrassing, provided some comfort in the midst of the storm. Meanwhile, Richard seemed oblivious to the emotional wreckage he was leaving behind. He grew more carefree, as if enjoying his time with Emma openly, as though there was no reason to hide anymore. It wasn't long before Stephen began to pick up on the tension. One evening, as we folded laundry together, he quietly joined me, offering his support in his usual reserved manner. His understanding, though unspoken, was palpable. His comments about Emma and her presence in our home stoked the fire of my anger, especially now that I knew the extent of Richard's betrayal. The need to act became urgent. I had to protect our family, not just from Richard, but from the looming threat that Emma represented. I started thinking about the one person who had always promised her unwavering support, someone who could help me confront this head-on. The more I considered it, the more I knew what I had to do. Then, Richard made a shocking announcement. He was taking a 2-week work trip for a supposed training program in another state. My heart sank, but my suspicions flared. Richard's company didn't operate beyond state lines, and he had bragged before about how his job didn't require travel. When he mentioned the training program, both Stephen and I were skeptical, though we didn't press him about it. Stephen, with a touch of sarcasm, pointed out that Emma had also taken time off. He questioned how she could afford such a long vacation, which caused Richard to freeze. His response was a nervous silence, his eyes darting to his phone, a giveaway that something was amiss. By this point, I had hired a private investigator to dig deeper into Richard and Emma's relationship. The investigator confirmed that Emma was planning to take the same time off as Richard. The so-called business trip was clearly a cover for a romantic getaway. Instead of confronting them immediately, I decided on a different approach, one that involved Stephen. With his support, we made plans to leave while Richard was away. After bidding him an overly cheerful farewell, Stephen and I, with help from relatives who were both disgusted by Richard's actions and eager to support us, began packing up our home. We would leave during Richard's absence, staying with family until we could secure a new place. My relatives opened their doors to us, offering a safe haven as I moved swiftly to protect our financial future. I transferred the remaining funds from our joint savings account to a personal account, knowing I couldn't trust Richard with anything anymore. As we prepared to leave, I couldn't help but notice Richard's belongings scattered about, symbols of the life I was leaving behind. This wasn't just about finding a new house, it was about reclaiming my dignity, about taking back control from the lies and deceit that had taken root in our lives. After some deliberation, I arranged for a pickup service to collect Richard's things and sent them to a designated location. With Mrs. Alexis's approval, as the boxes were carried away, I felt a strange sense of peace. The house was now empty of his presence, and Stephen and I shared a brief, quiet moment of contentment. A few days into our stay with relatives, things began to settle into a new normal, but I knew that the hardest part was yet to come. I was jolted by the sudden ring of my phone. Seeing my husband's name on the screen, I couldn't suppress a resigned sigh. His voice was panicked, pleading for money, claiming he had run out while attending his supposed training. The desperation in his tone was unmistakable, likely compounded by the embarrassment of being caught in a financial bind with Emma by his side. A mix of frustration and vindication flooded me as I refused his request, sarcastically suggesting he use the account he'd been draining for months. His response was a yell, but I remained unflinching, coldly reminding him he'd have to manage without any extra help. That's when Emma's frantic voice suddenly cut through the call, and Richard hung up in a hurry. The next day, Stephen and I arrived at a mansion, Mrs. Alexis's home. As we walked through the door, we found my husband and Emma in a compromising position. Richard, looking defeated, was on the floor, apologizing profusely, not to me, but to Mrs. Alexis. It turned out Emma, caught in the act, was actually Mrs. Alexis Dugter. She'd been forced to cut her trip short after a mysterious package arrived for her at their home. Mrs. Alexis, stern and disappointed, wasted no time confronting the situation head-on. Richard's apologies seemed hollow, as it was Mrs. Alexis who felt the need to apologize for the chaos her daughter had caused. The irony of the situation was palpable. Emma's affair with Richard had unwittingly forced her to face the consequences of her actions under her mother's roof. It was as if the tangled web of our personal and professional lives had come full circle, leading to an unexpected confrontation. At Mrs. Alexis's firm command, Richard visibly shrank, trembling with fear. Ever since I revealed the affair and Emma's identity as his mistress, Mrs. Alexis had been deeply upset but determined to rectify the situation. She had become my ally, apologizing for her daughter's reckless behavior and vowing to hold her accountable. As I stood there, I couldn't help but notice the boxes stacked around us, evidence of Emma's indiscretions. Mrs. Alexis chastised Emma, pointing out the shame she had brought upon their family. Emma's feeble attempts to deflect blame and pull Richard into her defense faltered under my unyielding gaze, which silenced any excuses he might have tried to make. Emma's admission that she didn't know about her mother's connection to me only highlighted how desperately she wanted to keep the affair hidden. Mrs. Alexis, known for her strong ethical standards, didn't hesitate. She insisted on an apology from Emma and made it clear that her daughter would face consequences for her actions. Despite Emma's dramatic protests, I turned my focus to Richard. I demanded he take responsibility for the mess he had created. To my shock, Richard turned the blame onto me, praising Emma and suggesting she would be a better partner and mother, even going so far as to propose raising our son with her. Stephen, having heard enough, intervened. With a sharp tone, he pointed out that Emma was just an intern at the club, quickly deflating Richard's misguided attempt to elevate her. Stephen also made it clear that Emma had no place in our family, criticizing her inappropriate behavior and reminding Richard that no amount of deceit would ever create a bond between him and her. This confrontation left no illusions about the deep fractures within our family, driven by Richard's betrayal and Emma's complicity. Mrs. Alexis's unwavering stance against their actions reinforced the solidarity between those wronged by this affair, setting the stage for an upheaval in our lives. As Stephen firmly pointed out that Emma wasn't even formally employed at the volleyball club, the carefully constructed image Richard had built around her crumbled. It became evident that they had both been living in a web of lies. Looking at Emma's stunned expression, I couldn't hold back. I explained how I had been the one supporting our household financially, covering rent, living costs, and Stephen's tuition, while Richard had contributed little, all while pretending to be a provider. Emma, overwhelmed by the truth, looked shaken, a stark contrast to Richard, who tried to maintain his pride. The fallout was swift. Emma was dismissed from the volleyball club for her involvement with a married parent, and her reputation took a hit. Alienated from her family and criticized for her actions, Emma found herself isolated. Meanwhile, Richard's attempts to reconcile were met with rejection. Stephen and I were resolute in moving forward without him. Mrs. Alexis, burdened with guilt over her daughter's role in this mess, received my reassurance. Through our shared pain, our bond grew stronger, and it led to new beginnings, both personally and professionally. Mrs. Alexis helped me secure a promising job opportunity, allowing me to focus on my career and the future I was now building with Stephen. Amidst these challenges, Stephen's unwavering support became my anchor. His pride in my work and the life we were rebuilding together motivated me to keep going. The love and respect we shared gave me the strength to keep moving forward, always focused on providing Stephen with a stable and hopeful future.